On the morning of October 7th, 2023, militants from the Palestinian organization Hamas launched what has universally been agreed upon as an unprecedented military operation. With the use of makeshift paragliders, pickup trucks, and Kalashnikovs, these militants, who live in what is called the world's largest open-air prison, were able to penetrate and, for a short time, hold Israeli territory, something that has never been done before in the 75 years of the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict. During the attack, Hamas militants massacred over 1,000 Israelis, among them women and children, and kidnapped over 200 hostages. Astonished and shocked at the horrors of the attack, the Israeli government vowed to destroy Hamas by launching a full-scale invasion of Gaza. To prepare for the invasion, the Israeli Air Force commenced a merciless bombing campaign across the Gaza Strip and placed the region under siege by cutting off water, food, medical supplies, fuel, electricity, and internet. In justifying what many across the world have rightfully called a genocide, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant stated, "We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." As of the recording of this video, over 20,000 Palestinians have lost their lives to the Israeli siege, with violence in the West Bank by both soldiers and settlers becoming increasingly more frequent. As is the case every time a conflict breaks out between Israel and Gaza, the international community becomes engulfed in outrage, quickly jumping to their social media accounts and to the streets to loudly express whose side they are on. The phenomena of this Middle Eastern issue being such an emotionally charged topic, literally everywhere in the world, is one that is often described as divisive, politically charged, and controversial. The notion that this particular issue is complicated and that both sides have committed atrocities litters the discourse, which makes it difficult for people who are genuinely ignorant on the subject to pick a side or understand what is even going on. It doesn't help that misinformation and twisted narratives are rampant in the reporting and commentary of the history, politics, and current events of this so-called conflict. And with such violent words, actions, and images coming from both sides, it's hard to pick the most ethical and moral camp to support. It is just so difficult for us to know who is wrong and who is right. But what if I told you that it wasn't complicated? What if I told you that the history, politics, ethics, and overall right opinion on this entire issue leans wholeheartedly on one side? And what if I told you that one of these sides is not only the wrong position to take, but in its very essence and conception is in fact evil? Well, my friends, as hyperbolic and kinda crazy as all this may sound, there is a correct answer to what I am proposing. And many of you are not gonna like it. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why you, as someone with morals and intellect, should not only support Palestinians in their fight against Israeli occupation, but also how the very idea of being pro-Israel and Zionist is in and of itself supporting evil. Genocide is universally accepted as evil. The notion that one people can and should enact violence against another on the basis of their perceived ethnicity, racial, or religious group is universally regarded as a crime by the Geneva Convention. What makes genocide such a heinous crime is the intent behind it. The violence has a purpose, and in the case of genocide, that purpose is to eliminate a people for being themselves. Genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to live of individual human beings. Such denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind, results in great losses to humanity in the form of cultural and other contributions represented by these human groups, and is contrary to the moral law and the spirit and aims of the United Nations. Many instances of such crimes of genocide have occurred when racial, religious, political, and other groups have been destroyed entirely or in part. Throughout history, there have been a variety of different reasons and justifications for genocide, but perhaps the most common one has been the need to enact settler colonialism. Though not always associated with each other, settler colonialism and genocide often go hand in hand as partners in committing some of human history's most atrocious crimes. In the words of historian Patrick Wolfe, the question of genocide is never far from discussions of settler colonialism. Land is life, or at least land is necessary for life. Thus, contests for land can be, indeed often are, contests for life. To justify settler colonialism and, eventually, genocide, perpetrators have to develop an ethical framework that positions their crime as a moral good for not just their people, but for the greater benefit of the watching world. To do this, perpetrators first need to demonstrate their righteousness and superiority as a people, that their success is mankind's success. Whether this virtue is expressed in biology, culture, or divine guidance, the perpetrator is to be the vanguard of humanity's progress. By being a force for the universal good, anyone who stands in the way of the perpetrator's aspirations is by default a problem, not just for the supposed champions of progress, but for the world as a whole. This perception of a noble people acting in the name of mankind's progress prescribes the would-be victims of genocide as a problem in need of a solution. They are dehumanized and inherently bad by default. Whether the excuse is their inferior biology, backwards culture, or heretical religion, the victims of genocide are an obstacle to humanity's progress. We have seen this playbook before in some of history's most atrocious calls for settler colonialism and genocide. The Western expansion and removal of American natives by the United States was justified in building what Thomas Jefferson liked to call an empire of liberty. The Founding Fathers, their successors, and most of the American public believed that God had destined them to possess the land of the savage natives, who did not use their lands to the highest use. America was to be a beacon to the world, and to accomplish that, the inferior natives had to be removed, replaced, and ultimately exterminated. One person who took the methods and justifications of US colonialism to heart was none other than Adolf Hitler, who used America's westward expansion as an analogy for his eastern conquests. Hitler and other Nazi leaders mimicked American colonial policies regarding the removal, segregation, and extermination of inferior peoples, to the point that they even referred to the Jews, Poles, and Slavs as Indians. Like America's manifest destiny, Hitler justified German settler colonialism and the genocide of other peoples by portraying his nation and cause as an overall benefit for the world. And I can prophesy here that just as the knowledge of the earth moves around the sun led to a revolutionary alternation in the general world picture, so the blood and race doctrine of the National Socialist movement will bring about a revolutionary change in our knowledge, and there with a radical reconstruction of the picture which human history gives us of the past, and will also change the course of that history in the future. And this will not lead to an estrangement between the nations, but on the contrary, it will bring about for the first time a real understanding of one another. At the same time, however, it will prevent the Jewish people from intruding themselves among all the other nations as elements of internal disruption under the mask of honest world citizens, and thus gaining power over these nations. By positioning their people as the naturally and/or divinely selected to lead the world to progress, American and Nazi settler colonialism was able to render their victims as inferior, unproductive, and an overall hindrance to mankind's success. The solution to such a problematic population ultimately becomes their removal in one form or another. In this way, genocide becomes a necessary evil for the good of humanity. Narratives like these allow for perpetrators of genocide to justify their crime, not only to themselves, but more importantly to the rest of the world, which has the ability to condemn and act against the crime being committed. It is thus imperative that such a narrative is maintained, since it is the primary instrument that allows for the crime of settler colonialism and genocide to take place. But out of all the criminal perpetrators of settler colonialism and genocide, no one has quite managed to maintain such a potent narrative like that of the State of Israel and its Zionist supporters. Founded on the basis of being a national homeland for the Jewish people, Israel has been able to propagate a narrative of victimhood and sympathy so successfully that much of the so-called democratic world and millions of its citizens openly support the country's establishment, expansion, and security at the expense of the Palestinians. In the past, these international supporters have condemned the racist apartheid state of South Africa, intervened in Serbia's genocide against the Bosnians, and even make an effort to expose and reconcile their own genocidal crimes. But when faced with Israel, who is currently engaging in the aforementioned atrocities of both apartheid and genocide, these countries and much of their public not only shy away from condemnation, but they outright support and incentivize the continuation of these crimes. So, how does Israel get away with this? The answer, just like the other examples, lies within the narrative. As a Jewish state, Israel has been able to justify its settler colonialism of Palestine on the basis of biblical history. Jews, as both a religion and ethnicity, have their roots in the land of Palestine, from where they have established their own sovereign kingdoms over 2,000 years ago. These kingdoms were established on the pretext of the Jewish people having a covenant with God, who promised the nation and their descendants the lands between the Nile and Euphrates. This covenant is not just something that only Jews believe in, as both the Christian and Islamic traditions also recognize this sacred agreement. However, what is often forgotten about this holy arrangement is that the establishment of the Jewish kingdoms were the product of settler colonialism and genocide. You see, even though many Zionist advocates claim that Jews are indigenous to the region of Canaan, neither the historical or biblical records support that. Both archaeology and the Bible show that for thousands of years before the covenant, a variety of different people groups and kingdoms already inhabited the area. Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, moved from his home of Ur, Iraq, to the Levant, where he would have his second son, Isaac. Isaac's grandchildren, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel, left the Levant for Egypt, where they would live for over 400 years. The Jews would leave Egypt for the Promised Land under the leadership of the prophet Moses. After Moses died, his companion Joshua led the 12 tribes to conquer Canaan, as instructed by the Lord their God. This holy conquest calls for and has resulted in what can only be described as genocide. Only in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as your inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, in order that they may not teach you to do according to their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would not sin against the Lord your God. With holy instructions for genocide also comes divine justification. According to the Bible, the Canaanites were deviant savages who went against the will of God and thus deserved and needed to be punished for their crimes of worshipping incorrectly. The Israelites, on the other hand, are described as a holy people, for the Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. In the book of Isaiah, the Israelites are described as being a light unto the nations, and God's very own salvation until the end of times. In the eyes of God, the invading Israelis are a more righteous and superior people than the deviant Canaanites who have inhabited the lands for a millennia. It is for the greater good of all God-loving people that these chosen people eradicate the inferior natives so as to please the Lord and thus the rest of humanity. Now, despite the obvious fascist and genocidal tones that we get from the Old Testament, It is important to note that most Jewish scholars and rabbis do not believe that these passages make Jewish people inherently superior to others. However, the narrative of Jewish biblical history is the primary foundation for why Zionists justify the colonialism of Palestine and the subsequent removal of its Arab inhabitants. With a fascistic foundational myth that calls for genocide in pursuit of the Promised Land, it should come to no surprise that the Zionist movement carries the same ideological baggage. In his pamphlet entitled State of the Jews, Theodor Herzl outlines the future plans and expectations for a secular Jewish state. Though not the first option listed, Palestine is mentioned as being a suitable home for the Jewish state due to the land's religious and historical significance to Judaism. Despite calling for a Jewish state to flee the anti-Semitism of Europe, Herzl very much saw Zionism as a European colonial project, echoing the same justifications that rationalized the imperialism of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Palestine is our ever-memorable historical home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. Supposing His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return pledge ourselves to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. Like European colonists before, Herzl and the Zionists saw themselves as inherently superior to those of the people of Palestine by justifying their colonial venture as one of providing civilization to a barbaric people, a venture that ultimately is for the greater good of the world. To establish a Jewish state in a region that is mostly non-Jewish, removing these inferior peoples one way or another is a necessity. This intention and strategy had been planned out by Zionists long before the Balfour Declaration was even proposed. When we occupy the land, we shall bring immediate benefits to the state that receives us. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Let the owners of the immovable property believe that they are cheating us, selling us things for more than they are worth, but we are not going to sell them anything back. In these colonies, an exclusive economy was to be established in which only Jews would sell to other Jews, limiting the participation of the natives and encouraging their voluntary displacement with the use of secret agents and employees from the movement. This exclusion from land and economic participation was justified by the Jewish National Fund on the grounds of redeeming the land from the Arabs, as they not only stood in the way of settlers who deemed themselves the rightful owners, but they also declared that the natives were incapable of using the land properly. Though a colonial project, Herzl at this time did not see the necessity of using force to expel the Palestinians, mostly due to the fact that he and other Zionists believed the land to be mostly uninhabited. This narrative of a land without a people for a people without a land was proven to be a falsehood within the first few years of the Zionist project, with minor clashes over property rights becoming prevalent between the settlers and the native Palestinians. The overwhelming presence of non-Jewish Arabs was a problem for the early Zionists, as it had become clear that simple purchases of property was not going to be sufficient to displace the native population. A close colleague of Herzl, Israel Zangwill, was particularly troubled by the large presence of Arabs, suggesting to the Zionists that we must be prepared either to drive out by the sword the tribes in possession as our forefathers did, or grapple with the problem of a large alien population, mostly Mohammedan and accustomed for centuries to hate us. Though believing that the Arabs were an inferior people and that the Zionists would bring civilization to a wild and savage land, Zangwill would end up advocating for an alternative homeland other than Palestine that was less populated, such as Uganda, Canada, or Australia. For Zangwill and many other Zionists, it was clear that a homeland for the Jews in Palestine could not be sufficiently established without the forceful displacement of the non-Jewish population. Zangwill thought it best to avoid such a confrontation. But for the majority of the Zionists, the drive to return to the Promised Land was something worth fulfilling by any means necessary. Despite being made up of wealthy elites, the colonial project of Palestine was something that the Zionists could not do on their own. The Zionists lacked the manpower and governmental authority to enact anything significant within the territory. However, with the outbreak of the First World War, the British and the French empires had plans to partition the lands of the Turks, which would provide the perfect opportunity for the Jewish lobby in the UK to push the empire into helping make the dream of Zion a reality. Luckily for the Zionists, the British and much of the European community had actually been in support of a Jewish exodus to Palestine even long before the First Zionist Conference. You see, the whole reason why Zionism existed in the first place was due to the hundreds of years of discrimination, oppression, and violence that Jewish people faced in European countries. The idea of Jews leaving Europe to somewhere else was something that European Christians advocated for since the Middle Ages, but the notion that they should settle precisely in Palestine was something that had been primarily promoted by Protestants, and more specifically, English Puritans. As early as the late 16th century, Protestant scholars had been arguing for the settlement of Jews to Palestine as a means to not only address their Jewish problem, but also to set up what they believe to be a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ, in which the citizens of the Jewish state would be forced to convert to Christianity in seeing the return of the Messiah. These English and later American Protestants would advocate for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine long before the first Zionist council meetings. They would in turn prove to be the biggest foreign advocates for Zionism throughout the remainder of the movement's history. During the First World War, the Zionists found themselves a willing ally in British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who found the Zionist mission to be of both strategic and religious significance. In 1917, George's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, issued the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government announced its commitment to establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. This British support would not only come in the form of good words from the empire's officials, but also through its military occupation of Palestine. After the official establishment of the British Mandate of Palestine in the early 1920s, Lord Balfour, Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill promised then Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann that Palestine would be set up as a Jewish state, ensuring that no representative government would be established for the Palestinians already living there. To help with the economic stimulation and construction of Jewish settlements, British authorities focused their taxation on the rural Palestinian peasants, pushing many of them into bankruptcy and allowing Zionists to purchase their lands while forcibly displacing the Arabs who lived and worked on the fields. Seeing that the British were forcibly trying to replace the Arab population with Jewish settlers who were mainly from Europe, rural Palestinians began to revolt against the colonists and anyone associated with them. The British suppressed these riots and doubled down on their policies of fining, taxing, and displacing Arab villagers of their homes and livelihoods, often arresting Palestinians without due trial and applying a policy of collective punishment in an effort to deter future riots. It is during this time of early Zionist settlements and Palestinian resistance that a prominent Zionist named Vladimir Jabotinsky wrote an essay called The Iron Wall, where he addresses the future Jewish state's Arab problem. We cannot offer any adequate compensation to the Palestinian Arabs in return for Palestine, and therefore there is no likelihood of any voluntary agreement being reached, so that all those who regard such an agreement as a condition sine qua non for Zionism may as well say nah and withdraw from Zionism. Zionist colonialization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. Shortly after the Iron Wall's publication, Jabotinsky would write The Ethics of the Iron Wall, where he argued that violently displacing and compelling the Arabs is not only necessary for the realization of a Jewish state, but also morally just, as he believes Zionism itself to be a morally just cause. The Iron Wall Papers were exceptionally important for Zionists, as they not only provided the movement with a moral framework, but also helped formulate the prevailing strategy of military deterrence that Zionists would use to both establish and maintain their Jewish state. This drive towards violent displacement was one that the Zionists saw as a rational conclusion for achieving a Jewish state. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, would not only declare the Iron Wall strategy as mandatory for the establishment of the Jewish state, but he even went so far to admit that he and his fellow Zionists were ultimately the aggressors and the Arabs the victims. Let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors, and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down, and in their view, we want to take away from them their country. Behind the terrorism is a movement, though primitive, is not devoid of idealism and self-sacrifice. This need to violently expel the Arabs to make room for a majority Jewish state became more drastic during the 1930s, when fascism in Europe was causing thousands of European Jews to flee to Palestine. This grand immigration of European Jews reignited fears of the Anglo-Zionist colonial project among the Arabs, resulting in much more aggressive revolts not just against the settlers but also against the British. Like the Zionists, the British thought very little of Arabs and Muslims, having a long history of brutally oppressing them in their colonies and publishing a rich library of Orientalist works designed to dehumanize their characters and thus devalue their lives. It was therefore in the mutual interest of the British to aid the Zionists in their efforts to violently suppress what they both viewed to be savage natives. I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger. Though he may have lain there for a very long time, I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to those people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or at any rate a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. I do not admit it. I do not think the Red Indians had any right to say, American continent belongs to us, and we are not going to have any of these European settlers coming here. They had not the right, nor had they the power. Throughout the 1930s, Jewish militias would receive military support from the British, receiving arms and training from British colonial officers and even operating alongside them in occupying and suppressing Palestinian villages. During the Arab revolts of 1936 to 1939, there were more British troops stationed in the Palestinian Mandate than in India, signifying both the empire's commitment of establishing a Jewish state as well as the threat posed by the emerging Palestinian nationalist movement. Seeing that both the Zionist settlers and the British Empire were working together to subjugate and uproot the Palestinians, some Islamic and Arab nationalist leaders decided to collaborate with the primary enemy of their enemies, Nazi Germany. Though many in Palestine and the wider Arab world took issue with such a union, the Germans provided an imperial counterweight to the occupying British, French, and Zionist forces. However, despite a somewhat mutual understanding, the Germans were not very interested in Arab politics, as they not only saw the European theater as more of a priority, but also believed the Arabs to be an inferior people, irrespective of their shared interests. Despite marginal German support, the idea of an Arab Axis alliance nevertheless threatened the British Empire's Middle Eastern holdings, causing a shift in attitude towards the Palestinian question and how a Jewish state should be implemented. This change in Palestinian policy would culminate in the 1939 White Paper statements, which called for the establishment of a single binational state that would maintain the promise of a national home for the Jews, while simultaneously limiting Jewish immigration and the purchasing of Arab land. Arab delegates rejected the White Paper due to disagreements of policy, but the Zionists rejected the paper's concept as a whole, viewing the British as now another obstacle in the way of achieving their Jewish state. After 1939, the Zionists would act in defiance against the White Paper, smuggling in illegal Jewish migrants from across the world and committing acts of terrorism against both the Arab public and British officials. In order to violently evict the British from Palestine, some of these Jewish militias even went so far as to seek relations with fascist Italy and Germany in the hopes that they could help weaken England's colonial authority. Zionist terrorism against Palestinians and the British authority would intensify with each passing year of the 1940s, as the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe made the mission of creating a Jewish state all the more dire. Towards the end of the Second World War, Zionist militias conducted a mass revolt and armed resistance against the British authorities, pressuring them to abandon the mandate of Palestine and leave its fate to the newly established United Nations. The shocking discovery of the Holocaust was a turning point for the global community, as it not only pressured nations to cooperate in a new global order to prevent such atrocities from happening again, but it also granted the Jewish people much needed sympathy and support. Countries that had once discriminated against Jewish people and even refused them asylum during the Holocaust were now wholehearted supporters for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The UN agreed that the best course of action was to partition the mandate into a Jewish and Arab state respectively, granting the Zionists 56% of the territory in spite of only making up a third of the population. Taking advantage of the international support, the Zionists reluctantly agreed to the partition plan, as they saw it as a way to achieve legitimacy in the eyes of the new international order. Though many Zionists were content with the results, others, such as the commander of the Irgun, Menachem Begin, declared to his soldiers that the partition of Palestine is illegal. It will never be recognized. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. Eretz Israel will be restored to the people of Israel. All of it, and forever. The Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world rejected the partition plan as an unjust act of colonialism and a violation of Palestinian self-determination. In spite of not having the consent of the Palestinians, Resolution 181 was passed in November of 1947. The following months saw Jewish militias forcefully seize their newfound territory by force, capturing Arab villages while expelling and massacring the inhabitants. The Palestinian exodus, or Nakba, was in full swing, with refugees fleeing to nearby Arab countries, creating a crisis within the newly established nations. During the first few months of the 1948 Nakba, Palestine was still under British mandate, preventing the Arab armies from intervening in the conflict until May of that year, when the State of Israel was officially established. Although a number of Arab countries declared war on the infant state, the Israeli forces maintained the upper hand in terms of equipment, training, and numbers, with few Arab battalions crossing into the territory and totaling only half of the Zionist soldiers. Despite the numbers, the Zionists and their international supporters were able to spin the narrative of the 1948 war as being one of a small David against an Arab Goliath, portraying the inevitable victory as a miraculous one. The narrative of being surrounded by savage Arab enemies wishing to destroy the only Jewish state is one that is still perpetrated today, which garners much sympathy across the Western world, who also tend to view Arabs with similar hostility, a topic that really deserves its own video. Brilliantly for the Israelis, this shift in the narrative was able to distract many from the fact that they not only outnumbered the Arab armies, but that they were in fact the main perpetrators of the conflict, as they had massacred thousands of Palestinians and forcefully displaced over 700,000 from their homes, confiscating their property and at times even razing their villages so that they could never return. This event, though so crucial to the establishment of the Jewish state, would not even receive much academic attention in Israel or the West until the 1980s, due to the atrocities committed being, understandably, quite shameful. With the release of Israeli archives and more consideration for Palestinian voices, there now exists a good amount of literature regarding the Nakba's events, motives, and consequences. However, in spite of the grueling realities of Israel's so-called War of Independence, Zionist narratives continue to perpetuate denialism and/or whitewashing of the crimes committed by the young state. Narratives such as Israel facing imminent destruction and the Palestinians leaving voluntarily have allowed the colonizing Zionist forces to portray themselves not only as the victims, but even as a decolonial movement against the imperial British and the foreign Arabs. This narrative continues to be perpetuated by Zionists and their international supporters to this very day, minimizing the past and continuing atrocities committed against Palestinians, all while portraying the victims of genocide as the true villains of not just this particular conflict, but also of the entire civilized world. This fascistic, colonial, and inevitably genocidal perspective is not one that solely rests on the conscience of Zionists, but also the so-called leaders of the free world. Whoever approaches the Middle East with even a minimum of objectivity has to admit that thus far there is only one vanguard of progress and modernization in the Middle East, and that is Jewish Palestine. A second factor for progress is Christian Lebanon, which at the moment is artificially subdued by the pan-Arabists and pan-Islamists of the Arab League against the will and sentiments of Lebanon's Christian majority. But for these two islands of Western civilization, Jewish Palestine and Christian Lebanon, the Arab-Muslim Middle East presents a hopeless picture from an American viewpoint. This sentiment of Arabs and Muslims being an obstacle to the colonial mission of the United States, England, and Israel is one that can be seen in full display in the last 20 years, let alone the last 100. The Zionists may be at the forefront of this fascistic colonial mission, but they are hardly the originators of such ideals. In fact, the truth of the matter is that the Zionists could not have really achieved their goals without the help of Western imperial powers. Zionism as an idea is one that was birthed from English Protestants as a way to evict the Jews from Europe. The establishment of settlements and repression of the Arab populations was done in large part by the British colonial authority. The recognition and support of a Jewish state revolves around the blessings of the imperial powers to grant Israel legitimacy, which is why Zionists then and now have invested billions to sway the opinions of Western governments to their favor, recognizing their colonial project at the expense of the Palestinians, of whom have near to no recognition in the so-called democratic world. Even today, in the midst of Israel's worst press coverage and worldwide condemnation, the United States, UK, and many other Western nations have provided diplomatic, financial, and even military support to the Zionists so that their ongoing genocide of Gaza can continue without interference. Zionist ideology is inherently evil. Its purpose and mission is fascistic and colonial, which has inevitably led to the crimes of apartheid and genocide that continue in full force to this day. This evil isn't done out of malice, but through reasoning. One cannot make a Jewish majority state in a mostly non-Jewish land without eliminating the latter. The Zionists back then were open about this. To them, it was a necessary evil to achieve a collective good, not just for themselves, but for the civilized world as a whole. As obviously evil as Israel and its actions are, however, I don't think it's fair to place all the blame on them. At the end of the day, it is the democratically elected governments of the West who, by virtue of their ideals, imperialism, support, and complacency, have given Israel free range to commit what can only be described as genocide. We, as citizens of the so-called civilized world, are the most responsible for the savagery that we are seeing before us. And if we are to truly see ourselves as good, just, and actually civilized, then we must cease to associate ourselves with such barbaric and savage evil.